Well, thank you very much, Tom Switzer, for joining me this morning to talk about the book, Dignity and Prosperity, the Future of Liberal Australia. And thank you very much for also contributing a well-versed and explained and explored chapter on the challenges to liberalism.
My pleasure, David.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do is just have a little bit of a conversation with you today, just to talk through some of the elements of your chapter. And also just to expand on some of the challenges. So I guess the first thing is you represent a classical liberal think tank in the CIS, and at times, I guess at the moment, you must despair as to the state of liberalism in this country. And I guess what this book is really about, and your chapter and others, is sort of trying to expound, well, why is it important? What is liberalism today in Australia about, and why is it important, and what do we need to do? So from your perspective, and you talk about it in the book, but maybe you'd like to elaborate now, is what is so important about liberalism for Australia?
Well, it's not just Australia, it's the Western world, and I think you're seeing a decline in classical liberal attitudes, not just in Australia, but also the United States and in Great Britain. And I say that for two main reasons. One's economics, and the second is cultural. So on the economic sphere, there's no question that we have seen in the Anglosphere a huge increase in the size and the scope of the federal governments. And this is not just because of the response to the COVID pandemic. This has been a trend that's been happening for more than a decade, certainly since the Howard Costello era. And on the cultural front, we're seeing clearly real threats to freedom of speech, particularly on university campuses. I think these threats are more pronounced in America and Britain than they are here, but they are happening here.
They're definitely happening here too, yeah. So why do you think, what's gone wrong with liberalism? Has it just given up? Have people stopped advocating? Did we become too comfortable after the sort of renaissance of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s? Why do you think liberalism's gone astray?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to perception. So at the Centre for Independent Studies several years ago, we did a poll of millennial Australians. So these are young folks born between roughly 1982 and 1998. And we asked them a series of questions that tested them about their views about the economy, for example. And it was quite striking, David. Broad pluralities believe that living standards had declined dramatically in the last 40 years.
Right.
But by any objective criteria, thanks mainly due to the productivity enhancing reforms of both Labor and coalition governments in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, the Hawkes, the Keatings, the Howards and Costellos, living standards have improved. Their real wages went up, at least until the financial crisis. Absolutely. But there was a widespread consensus among young people that things have gotten worse. And the other thing that was striking about the poll was that a lot of young people believed that government services had been cut dramatically during the course of the previous decade, when in actual fact spending as a percentage of GDP went up across a wide range of social welfare issues. So a lot of it comes down to perception.
So much for our information age and young people's education, that they can't get the basics right and understand where things are at today. But so that's really important. And in a number of elements of the book, we talk about language. And you've mentioned millennials, and clearly the Liberal Party, or the centre-right broadly, and here we put conservatism, liberalism, libertarianism, all the non-socialists I would put together, seem to be having a trouble in engaging young people as to why is socialism not the solution to all our problems.
Well,
what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, again, it gets back to this striking ignorance of young people, but this is happening, these trends are more pronounced, by the way, in the United States and in Britain, where you had a lot of young people voting for unashamed socialists like Bernie Sanders in the United States.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. Say what you will about Anthony Albanese or Bill Shorten or Tanya Plibersek and Penny Wong. They're not really socialists. They're still mainstream social
Dan
democrats.
Andrews is pretty
well, Dan
close,
Andrews might be the closest to it, but certainly in Canberra, I don't think it's fair to say that the Labor Party leadership is socialist, although they certainly believe in more interventionist policies. But it is quite striking, and I think it comes down to salesmanship. So, for example, a lot of young people in this country, particularly in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, are quite understandably anxious about being priced out of the housing market. But invariably they'll blame capitalism and market forces for this problem, when a strong case could be made, and we at CIS make this argument, but we're not alone, the problem comes down to supply side restrictions. That the governments are not giving power to property developers to increase more supply for real estate, which will match demand, and that'll bring prices down. Property taxes as well, they're too high, they should come down. So rather than blaming capitalism for the plight of young people being priced out of the pricing market, the housing market, it's more to do with government restrictions. But that we're losing that message.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. We talk about the two crises at the moment: an energy crisis, and people can't afford power, electricity, gas, whatever, and a housing affordability crisis. And if we've got two markets that the government has completely messed up over the last 2 decades.
And both sides of politics too.
You would say both of those markets are the most ruined markets around, where the government destroys everything through regulation and interference. And yet
this is not laissez-faire economics, is it?
No, they blame that. So yeah, you're right. So maybe there's a big problem in translating or delivering, but not only principle, but policy that is economically liberal, and certainly in those areas for sure. Do you see, and one of the things that I do notice amongst younger people in particular, but also across the board, we've seen a loss of trust in institutions. People have a pretty low view of major institutions. And do you see that potentially as an opening for liberalism? Because, of course, liberalism is the antithesis of big government, big business, big unions. Now we have big tech, of which people are saying they don't trust any of those. But as you say, there's this socialist creepiness around that, but the government's the solution. So how do you see liberalism playing in maybe bringing back the idea that the solution isn't bigger, all of these things, it's actually smaller, more individuals, more communities, smaller enterprises as a solution?
Challenging conventional wisdoms. It's not easy, but it can be done. Low expectations in politics is a priceless gift. And, I've given up on how many political figures who have been written off time and again, and they bounce back from setbacks only because they've made persuasive arguments. And history is littered with these kinds of examples. And I think that a lot of these institutions, there is a perception that there's a lack of trust. But again, I do think Australia is in a better position, even though we have wall-to-wall Labor governments, except for Tasmania. I think we're in a better position than in America and in Britain. There, the trust levels are very low. There's a real sense of anxiety, and that's why you're seeing the success of a lot of populist parties appealing to a different demographic. That's not quite happening here to the same extent, because I think by and large, Australia has, at least until recent times, had real prosperity and real stability. And so I don't think there's the lack of trust in our institutions here compared with the United States and Britain.
So if we turn to the overseas examples, just quickly, what would you see as the good, the bad and the ugly about lessons that Australian liberals, and admittedly we know that UK use of liberalism and America's use of liberalism are different, but if we use the classical term of liberalism, what are some of the good and the bad and the ugly lessons we can look at from those that we should be looking at here?
Well, I think we start off at a good starting point thanks to primarily the policies of John Howard, and I think of border protection. So 20 years ago, at the height of the so-called Tampa asylum seeker standoff, there was a widespread concern in the community that our governments had not been satisfactorily controlling our borders, exercising national sovereignty.
Yes.
And there was this people smuggling racket coming from the Middle East, going through East Asia, and we were seen as a soft touch. And in the course of 2001, at the height of that crisis I mentioned over the Tampa asylum seeker crisis, John Howard made a famous remark. We will determine who come to this country and the circumstances in which they come. Now, at the time, the elite media, the metropolitan sophisticates, they denounced him as pandering to racists and rednecks. But it was an important signal to send to a lot of Australians that we had control of our immigration. And as a result of those border protection measures, which were controversial, and they were cruel policies immediately.
But they were effective.
They were effective. They stopped the people smuggling racket. They saved lives on the high seas. And more importantly, from an Australian public policy perspective, they boosted public confidence in large-scale, non-discriminatory immigration. So from the next 5 years, from 2002 to 2007, the legal non-discriminatory immigration level actually doubled under John Howard. And that was because there was a widespread sense that our government had control of the borders. Haven't had that in the United States, and you certainly haven't had that in Britain. And that's what led to the rise of Brexit, well, contributed to the rise of Brexit in 2016, and certainly to the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. So I think that's an example of where we've been a trendsetter. On lessons from other groups, I think one important lesson is, and this is mainly because of the electoral system, we have a two-party preferred vote system, so it's more complicated here, whereas in Britain and America it's first past the post. Yes. So it's easier, I think, in some respects, for the political dynamic to be different in those countries. But I think one lesson is that we'd be very unwise to embrace Trumpism, for example. I think that Trump is a very divisive, xenophobic, rude and crude buffoon who is, putting it mildly, incapable of understatement. And I don't think that's where Australian conservatives or Australian liberals should see as their lodestar. We want to be classical liberals, but also reconciling ourselves with cultural and social conservatives. And I think we can still do that. But the problem with the Republican Party now is that it's gone too far down this cultural conservative and economic interventionist and nationalist track. And that doesn't work for a country like Australia.
If we come back to the Australian circumstances, and you know, in your chapter you talk about economic liberalism and cultural conservatism. How do you see that balance playing out? And I guess in that context, John Howard famously described himself as an economic liberal and a social conservative. But ultimately, I see him as a liberal, as in one of the great liberals like Menzies, who strode the political centre-right. But where do you see the opportunities for liberals and conservatives coming together and keeping that balance of the non-socialist forces together, like Howard and Menzies managed so well?
On economics, I mean, look, promoting productivity-enhancing reform, it is a niche elite subject. And it's not the sort of subject that's going to win over the hearts and minds. But the reality is, look at the consequences of those productivity-enhancing reforms from the 80s and the 90s and 2000s. It led to widespread prosperity. We had something like
prosperity,
29 years of uninterrupted growth, David.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. No country's done that in the OECD until COVID. And we've bounced back, although we've got some problems. So I think you've got to just keep selling the benefits of productivity-enhancing reform. John Howard famously said reform is like a never-ending run.
Yep.
You know,
it's a race. You always have somebody is always chasing after you, and they'll get past you if you stop.
Exactly, and that's the message we've got to send, because if we go slow on productivity, our living standards go down, and that means putting in place incentives in the system to encourage individuals and businesses to invest, save, grow their businesses, grow the economy as a result, and create more wealth. But I readily concede, in the age of social media, it's very difficult, but I just truly believe that any sound centre-right party in Australia needs to keep faith with the principles of market economics. And on cultural values, I'd like to see, and I'm not alone, I know that John Howard and Peter Costello and Tony Abbott say the same thing, I'd like to see senior liberals in Canberra occasionally speak out on cultural issues. Don't be intimidated by Twitter. Don't be intimidated by big corporates who are increasingly pretending to be social activists. Call them out if they say something unwarranted. I mean, I've been struck that so many business organisations are pushing for the voice to Parliament. It's not just a simple question of constitutional recognition. This is, as Malcolm Turnbull once put it, a third chamber of Parliament. An unaccountable, unelected bureaucracy that could actually change the governance of our Australia as we've known it for generations. These are radical changes. And radical change, as any sound conservative will tell you, can lead to loss as well as gain, and it's fraught with the danger of unintended consequences. So I'd like to see the Liberals speak out more on cultural issues. You know, call out the universities if they want safe spaces. For crying out loud, if you want a good liberal education, you look at all the different schools of thought, left and right, liberal and conservative, Marxists as well as neoclassical economists. That's what enriches students.
Well, I thought that's what universities are supposed to
Exactly.
be about. That's the sole raison d'etre, is they're supposed to be institutions of higher learning to explore intellectualism.
Absolutely.
As opposed to shut it down, which is what they seem to be now.
Even when Malcolm Turnbull, who's not really a favourite of conservatives and liberals these days, when he goes on campus, even he's silenced or deplatformed, as they say. So I think it would help if more and more liberals would speak out on some of those cultural issues.
Okay. And if we think about then what some of those reforms would be, you mentioned a couple in the chapter, but top of mind to you, if there were like 3 or 4 things you said, look, these is a policy initiative I would like to see the Liberals look into seriously and embrace, what would you
Well, I mentioned one,
recommend?
housing affordability is a big issue in the electorate,
So that's
particularly among younger people. So
opening
supply
up,
side reform.
planning reforms,
planning
building
reforms.
codes, all that stuff.
Now, admittedly, we have to recognise there's a flip side to this. The so-called NIMBY councils have understandable concerns about congestion
Yep.
and the demand for more hospitals and schools that, of course, will make these neighbourhoods more crowded. So there's a downside to this. But I think that if we want to address housing affordability in this country, we need governments to put in place policies that open up more supply-side options. I think that's the first one.
Yep.
I think education, there's a conventional wisdom in Canberra on both sides of politics that the Gonski school reforms implemented by Prime Minister Gillard were a good thing, but the cold hard reality is that despite the fact that governments have spent so much money in the junior and senior schools, the education outcomes have declined.
Yes, quite
So
dramatically, really.
There are ways of dealing with this issue. It doesn't have to involve throwing tax dollars with wild abandon. So I think education reform's another one. Superannuation reform. Give young people the option to invest. They shouldn't have it compulsory and put into a long-term fund. I know Josh Frydenberg, when he was Treasurer, floated that during the pandemic, and we had a bit of that option during the pandemic. But again, giving people the freedom to choose. And that way, you keep faith with your liberal principles, but you also try to win over young people who blame capitalism or the market economy for problems with education and housing and whatnot, when a narrative can be made that a liberal position, a smaller liberal position, is a more powerful.
Well, and I think in all of those areas you've highlighted, I would argue that the failures aren't of the market as such. The failures aren't of the interaction of individuals going around their daily business, as Adam Smith would have said. That's the purpose,
Yes.
They are all because of government, enormous
Yes.
government intervention and rules and regulation and taxes, and all of which have distorted those markets to such an extent that to even call them markets is a bit of an oddity, really, because they're certainly not free markets in the true sense. They're certainly not private markets either in the true sense. They are heavily done, and I think maybe to your point, that's something Liberals have lacked, the wherewithal to actually call these things out. Whereas Reagan and a Thatcher and others, if we remember, were very strong in their anti-government rhetoric. I think Ronald Reagan's famous words is the worst 8 words in the language is "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help."
That's a good line, but my favourite Reagan line is, "It's true hard work never killed anybody, but I figure why take the chance?" But we're changing the subject. But one of the other big issues is spending.
Yes.
Since the Howard Costello era in late 2007, early 2008, spending as a percentage of GDP has gone up, both under Labor and Coalition.
I think we're over 3 percentage points of GDP higher, which is a huge increase
that's
in
leaving
spending.
aside the COVID spending.
Yeah,
so
that's right. This is
obviously
permanent increase.
NDIS, the Gonski schools that I just mentioned, public hospitals, aged care, childcare, now add defence, I think $350 billion.
And interest payments too have now come back.
Absolutely,
at a
interest
huge
payments on
rate.
debt with the higher interest rates. Good point. So there's no such thing as a magic money tree, but I think a lot of young people genuinely believe there is a magic money tree. But ultimately, you need to have a degree of fiscal discipline, otherwise your dollar will be devalued, and that'll store up all sorts of problems for the Australian economy down the road. So I think there needs to be an educational campaign on spending restraint. That doesn't mean increasing taxes, because increasing taxes ultimately slugs growth and hurts incentives. But these are tough challenges, because if you're going to cut spending, you're going to hurt certain constituencies. And that's going to be hard for any Liberal government.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
I mean, not everyone's like Peter Costello. He did an outstanding job. Look, the conventional wisdom in the media is that Peter Costello was very lucky because he had the rivers of gold from the commodities boom. But the commodities boom didn't really start until about 2004, 2005. You know, when he came to power in 1996, the costs of iron ore and coal and gas were pretty small. They just boomed towards the end of the Howard Costello era. He put in place tough spending measures, especially that first budget.
Absolutely. I was working at the time, and I think over a course of about 2 years, we took 2 percentage points out of government spending. So, so that is a huge amount of structural reform to the budget to reduce the size of government spending. And then, of course, that then allowed revenue to match spending. And then as the revenue came back, as you said later on the back of those reforms, which were not just fiscal, there were a lot of other economic reforms, the government was in a position to not only increase spending at a higher rate because the economy was growing at a higher rate, but it was also able to offer rounds of tax cuts year in, year out to actually return people's money back to them. And as you say, I think the commodities boom's been going since the early 2000s, and yet we haven't had a surplus since 2007-8.
Yeah, the financial crisis.
Despite the multiple...
But the other thing to bear in mind is that when Costello was putting in place that fiscal discipline in 96, 97, 98, that was the height of the Asian financial crisis.
Yes, 97.
When South Korea went under, Indonesia went under, Thailand went under, there was a fear that this could spread all across the region and we be caught up in the financial contagion. Then we had the tech wreck in 2001.
Yes.
And then, of course, we had the global financial crisis in 08, 09. And we weathered those storms.
And the war on terror in 2001 as well. So I agree. It wasn't. It certainly wasn't an easy time. No. People look back and say, "Oh, gee, well, that was so easy to run surpluses." Well, if it was so easy, why has nobody else been able to do it? I agree. I think it required an enormous amount of fortitude on the government's behalf
We've been to very
do
lucky
that
to
and to stick to it for so long too.
We were very lucky to have an outstanding government during that period. John Howard, of course, but also Peter Costello, Alexander Downer, John Anderson.
Yes.
All
contributors to the book.
Yeah, Philip Ruddock. They were outstanding cabinet ministers, and they fundamentally had conviction. And I think ultimately politics is a battle of ideas. You have to have conviction. But the counter argument might be, to be fair, neither John Howard nor Peter Costello had to deal with this toxic social media and this political polarisation that social media breeds. We live in different times.
So if we talk about political cycles, the last part of your chapter and one of the things is clearly the Liberals and the centre-right's at a bit of a low point at the moment. But I think
put it mildly.
You and I know that's happened many times in the past as well. When Rudd came to office, we had a situation where we had Labor wall to wall. Didn't last very long. Howard and Costello and Downer and these guys and Houston and Peacock, they were out of office for a very long period of time. And
83 to 96.
Yep. Yeah. And again, we also had almost Labor wall to wall back during that period of time. And I remember, as I'm sure you do, many senior Liberals said the Liberal Party should just pack up shop.
Chris Puplik wrote a book. He was a Liberal senator. The party is over.
That's true. Very true.
1994.
So where do you see political cycles and how does that play out, and what sort of words do you have of wisdom for the despairing Liberals out there about where they're at?
I would just reflect on something that the great late Queen Elizabeth II once said. Now, it was admittedly in a movie called The Queen that was on the big box office in 2007. But it talks about, if you remember the movie, it's about the death of Princess Diana in the late August, early September of 1997. So this is only a few months after Tony Blair comes to power. Massive landslide victory. It's one of the biggest election losses for the Tories ever. And he's in the political honeymoon. And he captures the moment of Diana's death beautifully by lamenting the passing of the people's princess. And he was on the highest of highs politically, and he was giving advice to the Queen, who at that point mishandled the whole public relations surrounding the princess's death. And there's a scene in the movie where Tony Blair's saying, I've got all this political capital and I have to give you advice about how to deal with this potential constitutional crisis. He's getting a bit arrogant here, telling the Queen, giving her advice. And she replies, well, Mr. Blair, I've been around a long time and I've seen Prime Ministers come and go. The political circumstances can change very quickly and without warning. And 10 years later, Tony Blair leaves office, humiliated. He's widely despised across Britain, still is, by the way, as a failure as a Prime Minister, mainly because of his unconditional, or what appeared to be his unconditional and unqualified support for the US war on terror, culminating in the invasion of Iraq. He's never really recovered from that. So, as Enoch Powell said, all political careers end in failure. Tony Blair's ended in failure. And so many times in history, you think about Richard Nixon winning a massive landslide in 1972. Hard to believe he won 49 out of 50 states. No one could possibly do that today. He was on the highest political mountain. Within 2 years, he resigns in disgrace. George H.W. Bush wins the Gulf War in February 1991. He has approval ratings about 90 to 95%. The leading Democrat for the presidential nomination in 1992 says no one can beat Bush. I'm going to wait till 1996. And yet out of nowhere, a draft-dodging, marijuana-smoking, womanising governor from a backwater state, Arkansas, Bill Clinton, knocks off George H.W. Bush. Yeah. So the circumstances can change. And you mentioned Kevin Rudd in 2008, 2009, in the political stratosphere. Neither Brendan Nelson nor Malcolm Turnbull, as leader of the Liberal Party, could land a glove on him. And then Tony Abbott becomes the leader. And the overwhelming consensus in the Canberra Press Gallery, your Laurie Oakeses, your Michelle Grattans, Laura Tingles, your Peter Harches, your Paul Kellys, the Liberal Party is in despair. Tony Abbott is electoral poison, as Laurie Oakes called it. And yet he nearly knocked off a first-term government a few months later, and 3 years later, Abbott won a massive landslide election victory, all because he had the guts to stand up to the media zeitgeist on climate policy. So all of this is a way of saying circumstances can change quickly. What goes up comes down. And I know it's tough for the Liberal Party now, but the cycle will change. But they have to be in opposition, putting in place sound public policy so they can convince electorates that they're worth voting for. They just can't rely on the cycle changing. But it will change.
So what would be your message to Liberals out there today about where we're at and what we should be doing?
Well, don't despair. I think John Howard put it best after the Liberal Party's surprise Aston by-election loss in Melbourne in the Victorian by-election recently. Don't abide by this woe is us mentality. Remember, cycles change, and remember the Liberal Party should always be the custodian of the centre-right tradition and try to reconcile both the Conservative and the Liberal wings. The country may have become more progressive in recent times. I certainly think that's the case among younger people, but we haven't lurched dramatically to the left. Australia is still a 50-50 country, so don't panic.
Thank you very much, Tom.
My pleasure,
Appreciate your
David.
time. Thank you.
Thanks, mate.
Cheers. Bye.